look at this. Look at this. And you apparently have Mike Johnson that is open to invite Netanyahu to get to Congress. And of course, Chuck Schumer is 100% okay with this. Can you guys imagine this? What happened during the Obama administration, where you had this hostile war criminal that is giving address to Congress? Who really runs this country? I don't know if you saw this headline. Assal, welcome to RBN once again. Assal is amazing analyst, amazing researcher, amazing writer. You have great. I saw your last article on sanctions. Fantastic work. You got a book on Iran, I believe, as well. You very accomplished writer, also a good friend of RBN. So thank you for joining us. I want to toss this up to you, and we're gonna talk a lot about Gaza. I don't know if you saw this story. What's your thoughts on Chuck Schumer, Mike Johnson inviting this war criminal scum Netanyahu to give this address at Congress right after the United States said that attacking Rafah is like a red line, and Netanyahu was like, "I don't give a fuck about your red line." So I want to pass you. What's your general thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of sort of interesting things in what's happening, because first of all, it's not the first time, and you mentioned 2015 during the Obama administration, Netanyahu had a controversial address to Congress, and it was controversial at the time because essentially he was there to undermine the Obama administration when it was entering into the deal with the nuclear deal with Iran, right? So you have Israeli officials interfering in U.S. politics. And there's a lot of examples, obviously, of Israel and Israeli officials interfering in American politics. But what's interesting about it is that Schumer, just a few days ago, said, essentially made a statement that was supposed to be this very critical statement of Netanyahu, not Israel, but Netanyahu, because obviously he reiterated the U.S. staunch support for Israel, but criticized Netanyahu and called for elections in Israel. And there was a lot of backlash to that comment to Schumer from the Israeli side, essentially saying like, we don't. This is on the Israeli side. We don't interfere in American politics, so this is outlandish that a U.S. official would say that. Now, what's interesting about that is, number one, that's not true. Israeli officials do interfere in American politics. We see, again, Israeli Prime Minister, the same one, Netanyahu, coming to speak in Congress. But what's funny about Schumer saying that and then approving of this, it shows you a couple of things. On one hand, it shows that Israel has typically been a bipartisan issue in the U.S., right? The Democrat or Republican, staunch support for Israel is something that is like one of the only things, actually, that these parties outwardly agree on. And I say outwardly because there's a lot of rhetoric sometimes that makes it seem like they disagree, but internally they actually agree. But on Israel, they outwardly and very realistically are pretty allied in this. So it shows that the issue of Israel is becoming more of a partisan issue, because on the Democratic side, at least, some support is being lost. But at the same time, you see, it's all lip service. So you have Schumer trying to be critical with Netanyahu, and then a few days later, it's like, well, no, well, I mean, of course, we always welcome a leader of Israel coming to speak. Except that this isn't just an average leader of Israel. This is someone who is not only, I mean, he's already been a war criminal. This is not the current war on Gaza is not the first war in which Israel has committed war crimes under the leadership of Netanyahu, but this is the first time that Israel is on trial for genocide. And so you have the leader of a country on trial for genocide coming to address the US Congress. And then the other part I thought that was interesting about the backlash on the Israeli side towards Schumer's original comments, which were critical of Netanyahu, was, if you don't want the US to have an opinion about Israeli politics, then stop taking US money, then stop asking for US weapons. Exactly. So it's this just incredible amounts of hypocrisy where Israeli officials feel like they can tell the US what we should be doing with our tax dollars, who we should be giving weapons to, what deals we should be entering into, what countries we should be going to war with. But the US has no right to respond, not even in kind, but to respond in any way, shape, or form. So Israel is a sovereign country. What is the US? It's a huge mess, really, when you look at how entrenched that the issue of Israel is within our political system, and it's not shared in the public as much anymore. I mean, the U.S., given the amount of propaganda that Americans get vis-a-vis Israel, it's actually incredible that you see this shift happening, especially now with the events happening in Gaza, that a bipartisan majority have for months now supported a ceasefire, and yet our politicians won't do it. And this is yet another example of when, the government that is theoretically supposed to carry out the will of its people just won't do it, even when there is bipartisan support. This is a Democratic administration. There's overwhelming support amongst Biden voters, and they still won't do it. They come up with their own versions of ceasefire that are really just temporary pauses on genocide.
People need to understand that you have literally people within the Biden administration begging him to stop being a criminal. Because what Biden is doing, I need more people to keep repeating this for all the rule of law people. What Biden is doing is illegal. Biden said that Israel is bombing indiscriminately. Israel has blatantly crossed a red line. So it is a violation of Leahy's law in Section 6201 of Foreign Assistance Act to provide arms and munition to a country that you are acknowledging you are and that is credibly committing war crimes, especially a country that was found plausibly committing genocide by the ICJ.
Well, that's why they won't admit it, though, right? Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but that's why they won't actually publicly admit that Israel is committing war crimes. I mean, I've seen press briefings with journalists taking pictures on their phones, right? Just showing whoever is the state spokesman at the time, like, this is a picture of a war crime, something you cannot, even if you have detained someone, that you, and in a lot of cases they're journalists or they're civilians, but even if you took the line that you've detained someone who is accused of a crime, you still cannot strip them naked and torture them. That these are still war crimes. So there's this constant denying of any criminal activity as far as Israel is concerned. And I point this out because it took the US all of, I want to say 10 days to say that Russia had committed war crimes in Ukraine.
Yes.
About 10 days. It's now been over 5 months, and we have, I mean, you don't have to be a legal expert. You do not have to have, insider information. I mean, just looking online, you can see a stream of war crimes. Again, today, we saw footage of Israeli drones taking out 4 men just walking in open space, trying to get to their homes. So this is something that's repeatedly happened. But the reason I bring this up, why it's important of what you were saying, the reason they will not say it is because it implicates the US legally for those crimes. Absolutely. So there's constant denying of them.
And that's why those fucking weasels, Bernie and AOC, won't call it a genocide. Because that means the people who arm me, meaning Biden, which is their best friend, they love Biden. That means Biden would be complicit with violating Leahy's law. So while AOC and Bernie pretend that, oh, well, I don't want to be deflammatory. No, they are being political. They know exactly what they're doing, and I need people to understand. And Schumer, Bernie Sanders, and AOC, who keep talking about Netanyahu, they know what they're doing too. I peeped their goddamn game. Do you guys know only 2% of Israelis believe that Israel is bombing too much? So what the hell will these elections even do? You would just elect an even more violent government. Netanyahu is barely sovereign, barely making his own decisions. Because the same thing they do with Putin. They want to paint anything on the leader to, in this case, ignore how systemically awful Israel is, a terrorist state that doesn't deserve the right to exist. So they just paint everything on this leader, Netanyahu. Do you guys realize if Netanyahu took the advice of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Israel would have this motherfucker hung by a tree? I apologize, I forget the name of the leader, but there was a leader in Israel that accepted the peace deal in the 90s that was assassinated shortly after. Someone in the chat, please fact check me. I'm blanking on the name of a leader. So there's precedent of Israeli leaders accepting peace deals and being assassinated. And I promise you, if Netanyahu would have done what progressive would have done, imagine if he accepted a ceasefire Like within the first 2 weeks of this war, Saul. Can you imagine what the fascist Israeli settlers would do to him? You know, the Israeli settlers that is blocking aid trucks to go into Gaza, that purposely using starvation as a tool of war. Those settlers, that government, they probably have a military coup if he tried to have a ceasefire. So you gotta understand, what Netanyahu is doing is the will of the Israeli people, the will of the government. You had the opposition party in response to Schumer and Joe Biden's criticism that said we are all on board with Netanyahu.
You're referring to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, right? In
Yeah,
the
thank you,
90s, in the
Yeah,
1990s. So
yeah,
you know
this
he was
guy.
actually assassinated by an Israeli radical who was opposed to peace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that will happen to Netanyahu if he would have did what the West wanted to. What's your thoughts on that, Saul?
So the thing about focusing on Netanyahu, and the reason why this is a sort of political tactic of officials in the US, is because by focusing on Netanyahu, Israel is not the problem, right? We don't have to address things like why do we keep vetoing UN resolutions? Why are we giving arms to Israel? Why are we giving billions of dollars of military aid to Israel? Why are we doing these things for Israel? What they justify that by saying, well, the problem isn't Israel, the problem is Netanyahu, and they try to
Yes.
separate these two things. Of course, that's not the case. And the funny thing is domestically we do the same thing, right? The problem isn't American politics. The problem is Donald Trump, this individual human being that's not representative of anything, just this sort of anomaly within a system. And the reality of it is, whether you're talking about Donald Trump in the United States or whether you're talking about Netanyahu in Israel, they are not anomalies. They are very much part of the fabric of those systems. And the Netanyahu's predecessor before becoming prime minister this time around, I think it was Naftali Bennett. Naftali
Yeah.
Bennett has talked about, like, with pride, about killing Arabs.
Yeah.
Early in this particular war on Gaza, you had an interview with Naftali Bennett where he's asked about hospitals being attacked, children in incubators being left, and he got angry with the journalist who asked him this
Yeah.
question and flat out said something to the effect of, "How can you ask me about Palestinian civilians?" As if they're not human beings, right? So this is the person who was prime minister before Netanyahu. There are people to the right of Netanyahu, but there's this attempt to constantly take out individuals, right? When cabinet members and Knesset members, people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, make inflammatory comments, what the Biden administration tries to do again is take those individuals out and admonish them as if, again, they're not representative of what's actually happening in the state. Ben Gvir was an extremist Israeli settler who's now has a position within the Israeli government. So how does that happen? It happens because it is state policy to expand settlements. It is state policy to protect settlers, and it is state policy to allow settler violence against Palestinians. So when that is the state policy, this attempt to disentangle them is ridiculous. You removing Netanyahu does not remove the problem. The occupation is decades longer than Netanyahu. And by the way, the same thing happens on the flip side, right? They center Hamas rather than understanding that Hamas came into existence decades after the occupation. So it's this attempt to compartmentalize these issues to not understand the broader issue. The same thing happens when we talk about Gaza, as if Gaza is separate from Palestine, from Palestinians, from the West Bank. None of these issues are separate, but it is political rhetoric to try and separate them, to basically make people not understand the reality on the ground, that it does not matter if you remove Netanyahu from office. Somebody else will replace him. Potentially someone even worse may replace him. So it's the policy of the nation state of Israel, and it's the policy of the US government to support that state no matter what it does. That is at issue.